Obviously, in this week of all weeks, there has been one sequence of events that has been the overwhelming object of focus. The history of the human race is one of conflict and often large-scale violence, often veering into the savage and brutal, and yet there are certain moments that get framed as having special significance because it's generally recognised that they go further. They represent the very worst that human beings can do to each other. They show the darkest side of ourselves that we fear could come to the fore in the right circumstances, making us unrecognisable and hateful to ourselves. I'll say more about that in a moment. As I make this video, we are seeing two separate streams. Some people have moved relatively quickly on from the weekend's atrocities and are focusing on what's to come next. Focusing on that next part, of course, is absolutely essential because we are faced with the most difficult events that could play out incredibly badly for many innocent civilians and for the state of the world more generally. So yes, absolutely appropriate to focus on what is to come, but not at the cost of glossing over what has been one of those huge moments of evil. The dead are still being buried, their stories are still being discovered or surmised. The scale of the attack has become more and more evident. And when you think about how this would feel to any community, you have to consider as well, whatever you think of the politics of Israel's government today, or indeed in the past, this is a people overall who have told themselves for decades that they are surrounded by enemies. People who didn't want a two-state solution for Palestine, but who wanted the extermination of their community, the Jews, in a way that they have been persecuted across history. Well, these events have underlined that they were right. That is the ambition of their worst enemies, as they showed the very moment they created the opportunity to. My position on this channel is consistent. I reject all excuses made for harming civilians in the name of political causes, whether it's carried out by Russian soldiers in Ukraine, or Hamas in Israel, or Al-Qaeda in New York, or Israel in Gaza, or anywhere and anyone who does it. However much you approve of one side, however much you may associate with them culturally or politically, you should criticise this if they do it. Some people can do that. Some will do it when faced with the worst evils, but will try quickly to move back to familiar territory. And some will ignore the wrongs done by their own side entirely, or even shamefully support them. These things define who and what you are. One thing that has been notable in the fallout from the attacks is how the situation has divided the left, particularly but not exclusively in America. On the one hand, you had establishment or would-be establishment leftists, up to and including Bernie Sanders and AOC, condemning Hamas in forthright terms. But then you had the more extreme left, holding rallies celebrating the attack on Israel. In New York City, one speaker commented on the attack on the music concert, saying, "The resistance came in electrified hang gliders and took at least several dozen hipsters," a comment which was greeted with cheers from the crowd. I don't know what you're doing if you actually cheer and celebrate civilians getting murdered. It's worth noting, even the Russians had a sense of norms to at least deny that they had done such things, however unconvincingly. Hamas, on the other hand, videoed their own atrocities, posted them onto social media to boast about them to the world. And if you're celebrating that, you're putting yourself into an extremely dark place. I mean, Hamas is a religious right-wing group that has signed up to actual genocide of the Jewish people. Not a two-state solution, but exactly what they did when they got a chance: the elimination of Jewish people solely because of who and what they are. Leftists that find that to be the side they want to root for? What version of morality have you got left that you can use to defend your view of the world? Bear in mind, we're not talking about attacking Israeli armed responses in Gaza and the impact that can have on civilians there. Entirely legitimate focus for discussion, and will increasingly become so, I fear. For people who celebrated the slaughter of civilians in the first days after the event, that is not the spirit of what they were doing. And let's be clear, again, all civilian harm should be actively avoided, and the fact that you're reacting to an attack, Israel, doesn't change that. But that's not the same as saying that there is moral equivalency here. People who go house to house, slaughtering families, killing babies, raping women and kidnapping them to rape them again later, all the rest of it, that is not civilian deaths as so-called collateral damage. That is treating human beings as worse than worthless. When you decide an infant should die because it's a Jewish infant, and therefore, in your twisted logic, that would be a good thing to the world to have one less of them, that is the epitome of that worst that human beings can be. Jordan Peterson, in the time when he was at his best, would challenge his students to imagine that they were Germans living at the time of the Nazis, and he would point out that most of them, probably all of them, would have fancied that they would be amongst the brave few, standing against Hitler openly or at the very least in the underground. And yet, statistically, it was highly unlikely that even a single one of them in a classroom full of students would have been. Far, far more likely that they would, in various ways, to varying degrees of unease with their choices, colluded and been a part of what happened. That was always a theoretical exercise. But we've now seen Russians march into Ukraine, killing and raping the civilians in places like Bucha, and they have found plenty of Western defenders, including some in the comment sections of YouTube. And now we have this. Several stages darker than that. Actual genocide perpetrated against families in the most brutal fashion. There are fewer defenders, but still in our civilized modern society, there are enough to make you wonder exactly how far we think we have really progressed over the centuries. I mean, we've gone to the moon, we've discovered scientific marvels, we've created technology of divine sophistication. And yet, apparently, we are still cavemen at heart, apt to revert to brutish type as soon as the context permits it. Since we've managed to split on this in some places in the West, it's not a surprise that it's been equally complex in how it's playing out across the Arab world. Now, this is partly by design. We may dismiss the attacks as evil, which of course they were, but they weren't senseless in that they had a strategy and they had a purpose. Israel's close neighbours, Egypt and Jordan, reacted cautiously in the immediate aftermath of the attacks. They avoided condemning Hamas, calling instead for de-escalation. Both countries have populations that are strong supporters of the Palestinian cause generally, and have opposition groups that are explicitly pro-Hamas. Even the earlier stages of Israel's counterattack in Gaza have seen reactions. An Egyptian policeman, for instance, who killed 2 Israeli tourists and their tour guide as a reaction. Elsewhere, Qatar backs Hamas and funds Gaza, so no surprise that it has held Israel solely responsible for recent events. But Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates condemned Hamas, with messages expressing shock at the nature of the attacks on civilians. Both those countries, of course, have joined the Abraham Accords, We saw them normalising and improving economic ties with Israel up to a point. But Saudi Arabia is the key one to watch. It had been making headway towards joining the states that had reached some degree of normalising with Israel. Indeed, a number of Middle East observers have suggested that Hamas chose this time to make its move precisely because it wanted to disrupt that development. Support for the Palestinian cause is strong among Saudis, so the outbreak of the war, and no doubt all the stories to come from Gaza that will be emerging over the coming weeks, have made any progress more or less impossible. Palestinians have been in despair of the gradual move of Arab states to normalise with Israel. Before that began to happen, the line had always been held that the Palestinian question had to be solved first. But by all accounts, a number of the Arab leaders tired of the positions taken by Palestinian factions and became therefore open to taking initiatives that broke those preconceptions. For Hamas, provoking Israel into atrocities in Gaza, presuming they can survive them themselves, hence the large numbers of hostages that were taken, that would be likely to halt that progress for good, at least for the time being. They also hope to burnish their own credentials as the true champions of Palestinians versus the Palestinian Authority, generally seen as struggling and unpopular in the West Bank. That may or may not turn out to be the outcome. Hamas were not universally popular amongst the citizens of Gaza, as they'd shown some of that harsh face in how they ruled their own people, and also not everyone agreed with the intense anti-Semitic platform on which they stood. The Times of Israel reported that a 2022 poll found that 53% of Gazans agreed at least somewhat that Hamas should stop calling for Israel's destruction. And a lot more than that, 79%, said that they believed for Hamas leadership to be subject to corruption. Those figures will change once the community is under attack. Of course, you expect it to pull together as Hamas would hope. Again, assuming that Hamas survives the experience, they may have seriously overestimated how much Israel would be constrained in its response by the presence of hostages, given the horrific nature and scale of a provocation, which was probably greater than Hamas had actually expected to be able to wreak. It's worth noting as well that we shouldn't fall into the usual trap of assuming that the outgroups are all unified and homogenous and defined purely by the worst examples. Historian Arash Azizi observed that while Hamas is, by its own declarations, an anti-Semitic Islamist organisation, it nevertheless has, or at least had, different factions. Some of those factions, particularly those connected to the Palestinian middle class, not that interested in fighting the Israelis in this way or in an alliance with Iran. Under the right circumstances, they could come to accept a two-party state solution. That is not the group, of course, that has been increasingly empowered and emboldened by the steady stream of funding from Iran. And it's rather hard to see how it survives at all as a force over the coming months, given how events are going to play out. Brutalising events make things very black and white. Some people have been floating for what we're seeing now is de facto the emergence of the post-United States world order, the new multipolar world. They suggest that the rise of various new conflicts is the sign that fear of America, which used to be a moderating factor, has declined. Various groups are now hungry to push for parameters and extend their own power. Russia has started the largest war in Europe since World War II. China is flexing its muscles, building its military, zeroing in on Taiwan. India is becoming ambitious and virulently nationalist. Azerbaijan has stepped in to end a long stalemate with its enemy Armenia. And, of course, Hamas has shockingly invaded Israel, carrying out acts completely alien to any sense of what the existing world order was meant to signify. This is the point. A multipolar world is one that contains a lot more conflict and a regular helping of chaos as the reality of power politics takes over from one of established norms. Chinese political scientist Zheng Yongnian described the old order as disintegrating, putting it like this: countries are brimming with ambition, like tigers eyeing their prey, keen to find every opportunity among the ruins of the old order. Noah Smith wrote on his Substack, over the past 2 decades, it had become fashionable to lambast American hegemony and to yearn for a multipolar world. Well, congratulations. Now we have that world. See if you like it better. I'm not 100% convinced it's true in practice, but I do agree with the sentiment in principle. It doesn't seem to me that Hamas would have been dissuaded from following its destructive course just because America was still more dominant in the world than it has become. There were specific reasons why the timing was what it has been, and they are driven by changes in the Middle East, not by American weakness per se. That said, the Biden administration was certainly hoping it would increasingly be able to be less engaged in the Middle East as things normalized there, enabling it to focus elsewhere. In so doing, it can be argued that this provided more of an opening for Iran, whose hand in the attacks is still uncertain, but which is squarely lined up behind the goals and the objectives of Hamas. So, maybe, maybe not. But as I said before, I agree with the sentiment. A multipolar world will be much more like the world we've seen in the last year than what we saw in the decades before. I've seen commenters on this channel, some of them arguing in support of Putin, seeing his war as somehow being in support of those in US political life who oppose the drift into wokeism, for instance. And I've said as much to several of those people. You should think very carefully about the qualities of a world that Putin and others are seeking to create, and whether it's one that you would really prefer to live in to the one that you have. You certainly wouldn't be commenting on my videos in that world. For one thing, people like me would be in jail, or worse, for saying things against the approved narrative, or else so heavily self-censoring that there probably wouldn't be anything worth commenting on in the first place. And that's assuming your comments are in line with the government line as well, because otherwise you would be at risk. It's puzzling that people who complain about what they suggest is the enforcement of a narrative by companies like YouTube don't notice that much more brutal enforcement comes with the world order as modelled by the likes of Russia and China. None of that's to gloss over America's many failings over the years, including in Vietnam, Iraq and elsewhere. But the period between the Second World War and today contained the most peaceful era in recorded history. Many fewer deaths from violence overall. If you were holding out for a utopia where such a peaceful era would have no mistakes, no controversies, no conflict at all, well, good luck with that. The human race, which includes the brave slayers of babies from Hamas, has never yet produced a utopia of any sort. I seriously doubt the next few decades are going to be the time when we crack that code. In the meantime, the US is getting militarily weaker. Today, the US can produce around 30,000 artillery shells a month. In 1995, the Army could produce 867,000 shells a month. At the same time, China can now produce about 200 times as many ships as the US, according to a US Navy assessment, meaning that whatever advantage the US currently retains is eroding and quickly. This means that specific conflicts, currently the Ukraine war, have been able to make clear that the resources of America and its allies are seriously limited, unable to deal with multiple large crises all at the same time. And that dawning realization is exactly what whets the appetite for the non-democratic states of the world. I've said before on this channel, we should expect to be entering a more unsettled point in history, a time when things we thought had been consigned to the past very much re-emerge into a complicated present. Not thrilled to have been proven right on that in the way that happened this week. Let's just see if we can keep our cool and our nerve for the progression of all of this still to come.